Did you ever realize that a single sentence can quietly erase your place in the world? And what would you do if the people you trusted most suddenly treated you like you no longer belonged? My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 32 years old, and the night my father told me to leave my room was the night I learned that even family can become strangers without warning. It happened on a cool autumn evening in the quiet suburbs of Portland, Oregon, the kind of evening where the air smells faintly of wet leaves and the streetlights glow softly against the fading sky. I had lived in that house almost my entire life. After my mother passed away years earlier, it was just my father and me keeping the place together. I helped repair the roof when winter storms damaged it, paid part of the monthly bills, even contributed to the mortgage when money got tight. When my father's health weakened for a time, I was the one driving him to appointments, cooking dinner, and making sure the house stayed running. To me, that house wasn't just walls and furniture. It was the physical proof of years of effort, sacrifice, and loyalty. That evening, my older brother Michael pulled into the driveway with his wife, Olivia, who was expecting their first child. The moment they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. My father's voice became warmer, brighter, filled with a pride I hadn't heard in years. Laughter drifted through the hallway, like the house itself had been waiting for them. I stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes, listening to their excitement echo through the rooms that once felt equally mine. Then my father walked in. His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. "Michael and Olivia are going to need more space," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Daniel, you should clear out your room." For a moment, I thought I misunderstood him. The water kept running over my hands, as if time had paused. Before I could respond, Olivia leaned casually against the doorway, her expression carrying a polite smile that somehow felt sharper than anger. "Honestly," she added, "it might be better if you moved out entirely." The words hung in the air, like a quiet verdict. My brother suddenly found something fascinating about the luggage he was carrying and refused to look at me. My father muttered something about it being temporary, about family adjustments and understanding the situation. But the way everyone avoided my gaze told me the truth. This conversation had happened before I ever walked into that kitchen. I dried my hands slowly and went to my room. Packing didn't take long, but every item I touched felt heavier than it should have. Old photographs, worn paperbacks, the desk lamp I'd used since high school, each one carried memories of a life I thought was secure. When I finally dragged my suitcase down the hallway, no one stopped me. No one said maybe this was unfair. The front door closed quietly behind me, and the house that had been my home for decades disappeared with a soft click. What none of them knew in that moment was that the decision to push me out would soon unravel everything they believed was permanent. The sound of that door closing behind me stayed in my mind long after I walked away from the house. That night became the longest night of my life, not because of where I slept, but because of the silence that followed everything I thought I understood about family. I found a small rented room near downtown Portland, a modest place above a quiet cafe where the faint smell of roasted coffee drifted through the hallway, even late at night. The room was simple: one narrow bed, a wooden desk, and a window looking down onto the dim streetlights, but it felt strangely unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life. I sat on the edge of the bed, with my suitcase still half unpacked, replaying the scene in my father's kitchen again and again. The words were so calm, so controlled. "You should clear out your room." No shouting, no anger, just quiet certainty. And that quiet certainty was what hurt the most. I kept asking myself the same question. in the stillness of that room. How could everything change so quickly? How could the same house that had once depended on me suddenly decide it had no place for me at all? Days passed slowly after that. I tried to focus on work, on routine, on anything that would push the memory out of my mind. But the feeling of being replaced lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. Then small whispers began to reach me through relatives and family friends. At first, the stories sounded vague, almost unimportant. Someone mentioned raised voices inside the Carter house. Another relative hinted that Michael and my father had been arguing late at night. What had once been a cheerful household, welcoming a new baby, was now filled with tension that seemed to grow heavier each day. The change was subtle at first, like clouds gathering before a storm, but the tone of those conversations carried a weight that made me uneasy. A few evenings later, just as the sun had disappeared behind the city skyline, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my Aunt Margaret. She rarely called me directly, and the moment I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She sounded breathless, her words struggling to keep up with the urgency in her voice. "Daniel, something terrible has happened at your father's house." My heart tightened, though I couldn't yet understand why. I asked her what she meant, and there was a pause on the line, a long, uneasy silence before she finally spoke again. Michael and Olivia's newborn daughter had disappeared. Not taken in some dramatic break-in. Not carried away by strangers. Simply gone from the nursery, where she had been sleeping. There were no broken windows. No forced doors. No explanation anyone could point to. Panic spread through the house like fire through dry wood. Olivia, exhausted and overwhelmed, began to unravel under the weight of fear and sleepless nights. She whispered that something was wrong with the house itself, that the tension and conflict inside those walls had brought misfortune upon them. My father and Michael, once so certain of everything, began blaming each other in quiet, bitter arguments that echoed through the halls. The home that had once celebrated a new life had turned into a place filled with suspicion and dread. But even then, none of them understood that the storm gathering around that house had not yet reached its most destructive moment. Because only a few days later, a man in a dark suit would walk up to their front door, carrying documents that would change everything they believed was secure. Only a few days after the fear and confusion began swallowing the Carter household, the next turning point arrived quietly, almost gently, as if reality itself preferred not to announce how destructive it was about to become. While the family was still trapped in sleepless nights, arguments, and the growing panic surrounding the missing child, a black sedan pulled slowly into the driveway that afternoon. A man stepped out wearing a dark suit, carrying a leather briefcase. His movements were calm, precise, almost ceremonial. His name was Jonathan Pierce, an attorney whose visit had nothing to do with the family's emotional crisis and everything to do with something far colder, law. When the door opened, he introduced himself politely, but the quiet authority in his voice carried the weight of final decisions. In his hands was a thick file of documents, legal notices, neatly organized, stamped papers, bearing the seal of the court. At first, Robert Carter assumed it must be some bureaucratic misunderstanding. The house had stood there for decades, solid and familiar, the center of every family memory. But as Jonathan Pierce calmly unfolded the paperwork on the dining table, the truth began to reveal itself piece by piece, like a puzzle no one had realized they were assembling. Years earlier, Robert had taken out additional loans against the property, small ones at first, then larger ones, when financial pressure mounted. Some payments had been delayed, others quietly ignored. Agreements had been signed and forgotten, extensions granted and later violated. What had once seemed like manageable financial arrangements had slowly evolved into something far more fragile than anyone in that house understood. The documents made it clear with ruthless precision. The Carter home was deeply entangled in unpaid debt and legal obligations. Mortgage balances remained unsettled. Secondary loans had matured. Certain agreements tied to the property had never been resolved. The structure of ownership that Robert believed was permanent had, in fact, been standing on unstable ground for years. Jonathan Pierce spoke calmly, without emotion, his voice steady in the quiet room. "I'm afraid the court has finalized the decision," he explained. "The property will be repossessed under foreclosure procedures." The words seemed to drain the air from the room. Robert stared at the documents, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Michael paced across the floor, his movements restless and desperate. Olivia, already fragile from days of fear and exhaustion, lowered herself slowly into a chair, her hands trembling as if the weight of the news had become physically heavy. Then came the final detail that transformed shock into something closer to disbelief. The family had 10 days to vacate the house. 10 days to leave the place they believed was untouchable. The irony of the moment hung in the air with almost painful clarity. Not long before, Robert Carter had stood in that same home and calmly told his own son, "Daniel, you should clear out your room." Now another man stood in front of him, speaking with the same quiet authority, delivering a far larger command. "Mr. Carter," Jonathan Pierce said, closing the file, "you will need to vacate the property. Within less than 2 weeks, the house that had once pushed me out had lost its claim on everyone inside it. Less than 2 weeks after the lawyer closed his briefcase and delivered the final words that stripped the Carter house of its security, everything that once felt permanent had already begun to dissolve. A few weeks later, I saw my family again, but not in the familiar hallway where I had once dragged my suitcase past them in silence. This time, we met in a small apartment borrowed from relatives on the edge of the city, a temporary space that carried none of the pride or certainty that had once filled our old home. The moment I stepped inside, the difference was impossible to ignore. My father, Robert Carter, looked older than I remembered, not by a few years, but by something deeper, as if the sudden collapse of everything he believed stable had quietly carved new lines across his face. His shoulders seemed heavier, his voice softer, and the confident authority that once defined him had faded into a cautious stillness. My brother Michael stood near the window when I arrived, staring outside as though the grey Portland sky offered safer company than the room behind him. When he finally turned slightly, his eyes avoided mine in the same way they had the night I left the house, though this time the silence felt different. Back then, it had been indifference. Now it carried something closer to regret. Olivia sat at the small kitchen table, her posture rigid, her once confident expression replaced by exhaustion and uncertainty. The sharp edge in her voice, the quiet smirk that had accompanied her suggestion that I move out, had disappeared completely. She looked like someone who had discovered that life can move far beyond the limits of control or clever words. What struck me most was the quiet. No one mentioned the night I was told to leave. No apologies were spoken, no explanations offered. Yet the silence filling that apartment carried more meaning than any conversation could have. In that stillness, the truth of everything that had happened lingered in the air between us. I realized then that what had unfolded was never about revenge. I had not wished for their downfall, and the world had not rearranged itself to defend me. What happened was something far simpler and far more powerful. Consequence. The house my father believed was untouchable had always been more fragile than it appeared. The authority he once used so confidently had been standing on uncertain ground all along. Watching them now, stripped of certainty, I understood something that had taken years to learn. Power inside a family can vanish with surprising speed. Security that seems permanent may only be temporary comfort. And sometimes, the moment that feels like the greatest loss in your life is quietly redirecting you away from something already collapsing. I looked around that small apartment, at the people who had once believed they controlled everything within those walls, and I felt no anger left inside me. Only a calm understanding. The night my father told me to leave my room, I believed I had lost my place in the world. But time has a strange way of revealing the truth. That night, when the door closed behind me, I thought I was being pushed out of my home. In reality, it was the moment I stepped away from a house that was already beginning to fall apart.